One of the things I want to talk about now is about oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, this body is made mostly of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Now, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen are gases from the air. Hydrogen and oxygen combine together with two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen to make H2O, which is water. Carbon combines with oxygen, one carbon, two oxygens, CO2, carbon dioxide. So carbon is also involved in the gaseous form. It's also part of the earth, part of the trees, part of life, part of the livingness of this earth. So most of us is made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and a host of other minerals, elements, atoms involved in the process of making a living life form like us. Oxygen is crucial. It enables life on this planet. We don't know about other life forms elsewhere, but we are oxygen dependent here. And there's a reason for that. And I want to go into looking at how oxygen and carbon dioxide work in our system a little bit in a simple way. So I'm going to tell you a story. This is storytelling time, basically. So the muscles of breathing, the diaphragm primarily, the scalenes, the intercostals and so forth, and the pelvic floor. And again, I'm going to do a little piece on this later on another course, a little bit more on respiratory anatomy. But for now, those muscles enable the chest to change dimension so that air can be sucked into the lungs. We've got 5 lobes to the lungs, 3 on this side, 2 on this side, because there's room for the heart as well on the left-hand side. So those 5 lobes of the lungs, the air comes down through the passageways of the trachea, down through here, into the bronchioles, the tree of the lungs, and down into the little sacs at the end of those branches, which are called the alveoli. That'll look like little bunches of grapes on the end. And in the alveoli, we have a very thin membrane. It's a super thin membrane. It's the difference between the outside air and the inside of our body. And it is so fine, so thin, it's the finest tissue in the body. On that membrane, there's a little bit of water, aqueous medium, that stays there to enable oxygen coming through to move across into the blood. So oxygen, which is at about 21% in the atmosphere, comes down into the lungs and it goes across that membrane into the blood. Where it goes into in the blood is into the red blood cells. The red blood cells are evolved in a very specific way, in a shape that enables them to stack up without their surfaces touching each other. So they're kind of disc-shaped with a bulbous bit on the outside, that kind of shape. So they stack next to each other and there's space between them. They don't stick together into a coagulated mass. Now, of course, in some conditions like sickle cell anemia and thalassemia, the blood cells get distorted, they get changed in shape, which means that somebody's blood carrying capacity with those conditions becomes much more problematic. Their oxygen carrying capacity becomes impaired to the degree whereby they have a lot of body pain or other difficulties going on in their system. So blessings to those people, but conscious breath work also may be able to help you in those conditions. For most of us, however, we don't have that problem. The red pigment that gives our red blood cells their colour is a thing called hemoglobin, which has an iron as a key element of it. And hemoglobin is an incredible pigment, because what it does is it picks oxygen up and carries it where the oxygen is in plentiful supply, and it deposits it where the oxygen is in poor supply, in the tissues of the body. So it picks it up and carries it down to the tissues and releases it really beautifully. Hemoglobin is an incredible pigment. That's why our cells are red. Hemoglobin runs at a very high rate of saturation in a human being. 97, 98%, sometimes more, sometimes a bit less. but it's always well saturated with oxygen. So our system, even if we breathe badly, even if we're scrunched up in a little ball and hardly breathe at all, the system is so efficient, it runs with a high level of oxygen saturation. So we can't saturate the blood with oxygen much more than it is currently through conscious breath work. We do a little bit, 1%, 2% maybe, right? But that's not what we're doing with conscious breath work. We're not changing the oxygenation levels very much of the circulating hemoglobin in the red blood cells as the blood is pumped around the body. So that oxygen goes down through the red blood cells. It moves out of the hemoglobin into the tissues of the body, and it does so because of the carbon dioxide levels in the tissues. There needs to be sufficient carbon dioxide in the tissues for that oxygen to migrate through and go into the cells. That difference, by the way, is called the Bohr effect, B-O-H-R. Yeah, if you want to look it up, it's B-O-H-R, the Bohr effect. And some schools of breath work are really influenced very highly, and rightly so, by the Bohr effect. But there's other considerations we're going to pay attention to. So that oxygen then goes into the cells. What's the oxygen do in the cells? Well, it's involved with creating energy. The energy we need to speak, to talk, to breathe, to think, to move. And that energy is created in a part of the cell called the mitochondria. Mitochondria. The mitochondria is, it looks like a little bean, a tiny little bean inside the cell, and it has these, what are called cristae, which are like interdigitating parts to them, each of which has an energy-making factory on them, all along them, these little bubbles of energy-making factories. It's an incredible piece of intracellular kit. And a long time ago, so the evolutionary stories go, that originally the mitochondria and the rest of the cell were two different organisms that merged together. We're made up, historically, a long time ago, like 3.5 billion years ago, of two different life forms that joined together. Anyway, partly we know that, by the way, because all of our mitochondria have the same DNA. We all share the same mitochondrial DNA, and that's through the matrilineal line. So that's interesting. We are all related at a mitochondrial level. Those mitochondria, inside of them, there's a process that happens which is sometimes called the citric acid cycle, sometimes called the Krebs cycle. But basically what it is doing is taking the breakdown products of the carbohydrate digestion that we've done. Yeah? So those breakdown products are simple sugars, a sugar called glucose, which is C6H12O6, so 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens, but that's broken down into smaller pieces, and we split the atoms apart of that. So we're pulling the carbons and the hydrogens apart, hydrogens and the oxygens apart, and we're releasing the energy in that structure, and we're capturing the energy in the mitochondria. So it's the same kind of energy as in a fire. You've seen a fire, you've seen how hot it is. Well, that's the breaking of the bonds in the wood. Same kind of bonds in the wood. So what we're doing is we're taking that sugar molecule and we're breaking it open, and capturing the energy inside that and wrapping it up. And it's wrapped up in a very special bond called a phosphate bond. So we have a molecule called adenosine diphosphate, and there's some extra phosphates hanging around. That energy is grabbed and wrapped up in a phosphate bond, and that becomes an adenosine triphosphate. So it goes from ADP to ATP, and energy is caught in that process. Spare energy is given off as heat. Yeah? I believe that some is given off as biophotonic light, just like in a fire. And my belief is that one of the things we're working with in conscious breath work is increasing the mitochondrial communication intercellularly between cells through that biophotonic light. I can't prove that yet. There's not enough research on this. This is just something that I've experienced in my breathwork practices. I'll come back to that in a minute. That's kind of powerful, right? We know a little bit about biophotonic light. It's given off in the mitochondria. in that process. So in that process, we're warming the body. In that process, we're capturing energy for future usage. What does oxygen have to do with this? Well, what oxygen does in this process is wrap itself up with the waste products of that energy production. So at the end of that energy production, we've got carbon, we've got hydrogen, yeah? And what we need to do is bind those up so they can be moved out of the mitochondria. How do we do that? Well, with oxygen is the answer. The hydrogen, two hydrogens and one oxygen create H2O, and then water goes off. We make water through the energy production process. The carbon, yeah, we need C and two oxygens, CO2, yeah. So the carbon gets bound with two oxygens and becomes carbon dioxide and goes off into the tissues and invites more oxygen into the cells. So in that energy production process, we're giving off carbon dioxide and water. There are other things produced, reactive oxygen species and various other things which we can pay attention to another time. But some of those reactive oxygen species, which I won't go into in great detail, some of those are really helpful in terms of cellular communication again. So it's only when the reactive oxygen species are out of balance they become a problem, and that's a thing called oxidative stress, for those of you who want to look that up, right? But it's only when they're out of balance it's a problem. So oxygen is used to pick up the waste hydrogen energy production. That's what it does. The carbon dioxide that we produce and the carbon dioxide in the blood then balances and buffers the blood. It keeps the blood in the right state of alkaline acid balance, the right pH. pH is the term that's used to refer to alkaline and acid balance. And it keeps the blood in the right pH, the right alkaline acid balance, and that's called buffering. It breaks up into ions, and the ions do that job, but I don't want to go into that too much right now. I just want to say that's what it does. Not only that, but the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood is what enables the brain to measure blood gases and to know when more oxygen is needed. So it's the carbon dioxide levels that are registered in the carbon dioxide metrics, the carbon dioxide registering mechanisms in the brain, that inspires the next in-breath. So if we blow off lots of carbon dioxide out of our body, we're reducing the carbon dioxide levels in the blood. If we do that too much, we can create intolerance to carbon dioxide, and that leads us into a state of breathlessness, constant panic and difficulty. So a key element of breath work, one is breathing through the nose. A second key element is if we do shift and move carbon dioxide, we have to do breath holding as well, because breath holding rebalances the carbon dioxide mechanisms in the body. So we've got key pieces here, and we will be doing some breath work where we're moving carbon dioxide from the tissues into the blood, from the blood out through the lungs into the air. Okay, but then we want to rebuild that, and partly that's building another part of the process, which again some breath workers don't pay attention to, which is mitochondrial fitness. Mitochondrial fitness is the capacity, like I said, for the intercellular communication between the mitochondria, and also their capacity to move fast in terms of producing ATP from the ADP, moving that carbon dioxide and water out of the system so they can be efficient, highly efficient energy-making factories. And we get that mitochondrial fitness from aerobic practice, working with the body, moving the body in a powerful way, moving the body while breathing in and out through the nose, in and out through the nose as we move. And we're going to create that mitochondrial fitness so that those systems can become super efficient. And that requires us to move carbon dioxide out of the tissues so we can clear the way for more production. So it's not a backlog, there's not a stagnancy in there. But then again, we need to build that carbon dioxide tolerance back up again through breath holding so we can work really intelligently with our practices. What I'm inviting for you with this simple storytelling is an understanding of how we can do all of this and more. Because like we've said, the breath also gives us an integrated experience of the centers of the body. It gives us an integrated experience of heart rate variability and how the heart and the brain connect and take us into a place of flow and well-being. There are other elements, like we've talked about with the mindfulness of breathing, where we're training the brain. We're focusing and training the brain and changing the way the brain functions by use of the breath. We can use conscious breath work in so many different ways. Thank you for listening.